Hello, and welcome to the November 2019 branch presentation by the London and Middlesex branch of Ontario Ancestors. Our presenter is Bryan MacClure. Bryan is currently in his fourth year of his PhD in history at the University of Western Ontario. He completed his undergraduate degree in history and English literature at Queen's University and completed his master's degree in modern Irish history at Trinity College, Dublin. His master's research was entitled Now We See Through a Glass Darkly, Memorialization of the First World War in Dublin. His PhD topic is entitled He Gave His Life for the Empire, Memory, Memorials, and the Identity in the British Empire After the First World War, and is under the supervision of Professor Jonathan Vance. The title of this presentation is Memory, Memorials, and Imperial Identity After the First World War. In this talk, Bryan will be discussing a variety of different memorials created for individuals who were killed in the war. The talk will examine the similarities and differences between memorial construction and remembrance in the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Rather than examine community memorials, the talk will explore how individuals sought to commemorate their loved ones in ways that satisfied their needs to mourn and remember. By examining the language of their memorials, the visual images, and the details of individuals who were commemorated, Bryan hopes to be able to show the various ways the war was commemorated outside of governments. The talk will discuss the ways that remembrance is culturally shared across Britain and the Dominions in a manner that has been perpetuated to the modern day. Without further ado, I present Bryan MacClure.
Thanks very much. It's very good to be here. Professor Vance was supposed to be your speaker for today, but he had a prior engagement, so he asked me to come in and cover. So hopefully I'm a good substitute for him.
His prior engagement is that he's receiving an award for his book that he was going to be talking about.
Yeah. So he's definitely, if you get a chance to see him at another location, he's a great speaker and it's a great book. So hopefully I can try and cover up as best as I can for him. So today I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about my current PhD research project where I'm examining the construction of memorials throughout the British Empire after the First World War. And specifically kind of looking at how did people understand, how did people try to remember the war in the immediate aftermath. So this is in the 1920s and the 1930s. So this is kind of the first, what would be the first generation of mourners and people who are commemorating the war. And it's important to know that one of the things that's coming up is this idea of an imperial identity that exists. And so this is a good image at the front here. This is King George V, who was king at the time during the war and after, visiting Tynecott Cemetery, which is in Belgium. And this is important because he is the king of not just Britain or Canada or Australia, he's king of the empire. And so his participation was meant to try and bring an empire together and unify their memory and their kind of common existence. So this is kind of where I'm kind of looking at, kind of going with how do people try and understand what the empire meant to them after the war. Do you want to go to the next slide?
Yeah. Sorry.
So how am I actually doing this? I'm looking at these types of memorials. So I'm looking at memorials that are dedicated to not a large group of people, but rather to a single individual or brothers or groups of people. So these are three examples here. So this is in England, two brothers from.
There we go.
Is that everyone see better now? Okay.
Somewhat better.
Some of the images, I didn't take all of the photographs. I'm gonna say that right now. There was no way all of these photographs that I could take. I have not been to all of these places, so the internet's a great research tool. But as you can see, I'm kind of looking at individuals. How are individuals commemorated? So two brothers in England, Irish Canadian who is commemorated in Ireland, and then stained glass windows that's in Montreal. So this is kind of a different take that a lot of people have looked at. A lot of people, when they look at memorials and the aftermath of the First World War, it's oftentimes looking at the big picture. So Canada, for example, how did Canada remember? How did London, the city of London, remember? How did the University of Western remember? Or how did a specific church remember? And so it's often a focus on memorials that have long lists of names. And so I wanted to take a look and say, well, let's look at how did individual people, how did single families or wives or husbands or brothers, how did they try to remember in different ways? And I've started to discover thousands and thousands of these types of memorials, not only in Canada, but in Britain, Ireland, Australia, and New Zealand, where they're just they're all over the place, and you can oftentimes, many people forget that they are there, they're forgotten, they're kind of hidden in a little corner sometimes. So I'm starting to look at these and trying to discover not what did a community think, but how did individuals think about the war. If you want to go to the next slide. So to start off, I kind of want to talk actually a little bit about why people would want to create these individual memorials. And part of it was a reaction to the aftermath of the war and what happened to the bodies. During this time, during the late 19th and into the early 20th century, many people were obsessed with mourning.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I'll go back.
We'll be getting to that in a second.
Yeah.
Many people were obsessed with mourning and creating what they called the good death. Now, the idea of the good death is that the person dies peacefully, surrounded by their family, their loved ones. They have lived a good life, and particularly as this was a very fairly religious society still at this time, they were very much concerned, were they at peace with God? And so for many of them, this was the easiest way to know is that on their deathbed, they make peace with their family and everything, and they die a very peaceful death. And so this was romanticized as the good death. And the war creates a very big problem to try and understand what the good death, how the good death happens for family members, particularly because they're overseas. They're fighting in France or Belgium. And when they die, the family doesn't know how they die. And so the problem becomes that they want to try and recreate this idea of the good death. And so oftentimes they want the physical body to be able to do so. Now, a big problem occurs in that after the war, the Imperial War Graves Commission is created, and they're placed in charge of all the cemeteries. So when you travel, if you've ever been to one of the battlefields in France or Belgium, or anywhere else in the world for the First or Second World War, the cemeteries and memorials are all owned and controlled by the Imperial War Graves Commission. And they decided to not allow any bodies to return home. So Britain and the Empire is unique amongst all fighting nations in the First World War in that if you had a family member fight and you wanted their body back, you could not get it back. The Americans returned their soldiers' bodies. The French allowed the bodies to be returned. But in Britain, the British Empire said no bodies are to be returned whatsoever. So the case is that this results in these unbelievably massive cemeteries for the British war dead, which are still to this day, as these photos kind of attest, but they are immaculately maintained. The Commission continues its work to this day for over 100 years now, and they continue to maintain these cemeteries and the memorials. But it creates a problem for individuals in the fact that they cannot mourn their dead because they don't have a physical body to mourn over. Now, I put a photo of a headstone because this is the standard headstones that they use for the cemeteries. So it oftentimes contains a religious symbol, so a cross, but if the soldier was Jewish or Sikh or Muslim, they would put their respective religious icon on the headstone. It would put their name, their rank, what unit they served under. They would put when they died. If they knew how old they were, they would put their age. At the top, they would put a logo for their unit. So all the Canadian units, all the Canadian units have the same one because the Canadian government said we'll put the maple leaf. But if it was British, you didn't put a symbol of Britain, you put the unit you were fighting under. But for me, what's kind of very interesting is at the very bottom here, which is they allowed families to put a few lines of text for an epitaph. It was their only concession to the families back home to have some part in the burial of their loved ones. And so many of them have some very poignant, very powerful messages on them. This individual has only son of Mrs. Patrick Russell, so his mother put her name, identifying kind of the connection there. But it was a very contentious issue. There was hundreds of thousands of graves to be done, and the commission realized it was going to cost them a lot of money. And so they tried to make people have to pay to put those inscriptions on. The governments fought back, so the Canadian government actually funded any Canadian who wanted to put an epitaph on. The Canadian government paid for it for them. The Australians did the same thing. The British government eventually forced the commission to back down, so they encouraged people to donate money to help cover the costs, because they were doing this for thousands of individuals. So what we see already here is that the burial of the body, putting the headstone up, or the commemorative grave, is out of the hands of individuals. The families, the friends cannot get involved. They have very little input to try and remember their loved ones. Go ahead to the next slide. We then have another issue with the commissions, which is the missing. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were missing after the war, which obviously for attempting for families to recreate the good death, it creates a huge problem because they're still left in limbo by the end of 1918 and into 1919. Will their bodies be found? Will they not be found? Maybe they're prisoners of war. Maybe they're in a hospital somewhere, forgotten who they are. So for many of them, this problem of the missing is a huge issue, because how do they commemorate someone without a body? This is what they're used to. And so the commission attempted to solve this by creating these massive memorials to the dead. So one of the largest and most famous ones is the Menin Gate, which is in Belgium, in the city of Ypres. And then, of course, Canada built its own, the Vimy Ridge Memorial, which is in France. These memorials, there are others throughout France as well for Australians and New Zealanders, as well as across the world in Gallipoli, for example, in Basra in Iraq, and even in India, in Delhi, for soldiers from the Indian Army. There's these memorials to the missing are all over, and it's their attempt to try and give those soldiers who have no grave an attempt to give them a kind of substitute grave by listing them with their fellow missing on these memorials. And so these massive monuments have attracted a lot of attention. But for the families whose individuals who are named there, they're still left lacking the ability to mourn properly. For example, a lot of people love to come and rub their hands over the names of the missing. Now, at Vimy, it's actually fairly easy to do that because the names of the missing are kept lower down, so it's actually kind of on eye level. But in the Menin Gate, for example, it actually runs almost to the very top. So if the name's at the top, you can kind of, you're struggling to actually come up there and see it. It's hard to try and find a way to commemorate them. So the result is that a lot of people try to recreate cemeteries and graves at home by creating these memorials to the individuals. Do you want to
ask a question?
Yes.
How were these memorials treated during the Second World War? Did they bomb them, or
No.
Both sides kept away?
They were left alone. So during the Second World War, most of the memorials were left alone by the occupying German forces. The only memorial that received any damage was the Australian memorial in France, and that was partially because it was very close to where the French and German armies met in 1940. But for the most part, they were left alone. And so there is records of Canadian troops when the liberation starts taking place of them, going to visit them to see what condition they are, and they found that after the war, most of them were actually in fairly good condition. There is records that the French gardeners and employees who had been hired by the commission actually continued working in the cemeteries during the Second World War. Sometimes they did it fairly secretly, or they did it kind of not as regularly as they would have been in peacetime. But for the most part, most of the cemeteries were actually left alone during the Second World War. So there was not a lot of work needed to be done to bring them back up to shape. But what results is that a lot of individuals want to create memorials to try and remember. And so the rest of this talk now is I think, going to be more or less showing you some of the wide variety of ways people try to commemorate. And it's interesting way to look and think about how people at this point, there was no set real way of how to commemorate. A lot of people felt that, the standards that we have kind of today with the wearing of the poppy and the 2-minute silence, a lot of this had either not been developed when these memorials were built or were just being introduced. So they don't have the same history about how to commemorate the war. And so it's interesting to look at how these people tried to commemorate. And so each slide is going to kind of be looking at different ways, different groups of people, or try to commemorate in different ways. So one of the first ways, as I said, with the idea of the good death, is being a good Christian. And so many of these people attempted to protect and express their Christian faith, and particularly those who had died on the memorials. So many of these would contain references to biblical verses that they would use over and over again. Now, one of the most common ones that I have seen in my research that comes up again and again and again is, greater love hath no man than this, that he who dies for his friends, which is one that is repeated over and over again for memorials on soldiers. Greater, this idea of camaraderie and friendship is something that they're trying to enforce, but also the fact that they did die in a very similar way to Christian martyrs, and particularly Jesus, in the idea that they did die for a good cause and that they did do it for religious belief. Now, some of them, and this one is an interesting one, this Harold Joseph John Guppy. He died in Palestine during the fighting to liberate Jerusalem, during the fighting there. And the language on it is a very interesting one. He was killed in Palestine at the moment of victory. His body now rests in the Holy Land, where his regiment had captured, and in sight of Jerusalem. So here while they do not directly use kind of biblical quotes, they're very clearly trying to point to that he was fighting to free the Holy Land and being in sight of some of these important places for the Christian faith. And others, as you can see, they have as well. So this one, I've kind of put the little quote here because it's fairly small to try and read, which is directly taken, right, still used at funerals today. Walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. And so this is used, and so it's very clear that this memorial is meant to be the funeral that this soldier never actually got, or the funeral that the family is uncertain of what he received. And so they're trying to make sure he gets that proper sending off, as if he had not actually gone to war at all. If you want to head to the next slide. These ones is interesting. So I mentioned as well, memorials, the headstones had the epitaph at the bottom. And so many people try to make the links between the two, their memorials at home and the memorials when they were able to put an epitaph in. So these two memorials are examples of when their memorials at home match actually the epitaph. So Frank Hill-Gaskill, his headstone has the line, "Who had it not in him to fear." So it's on his head. If you go to his headstone, it says that, and his memorial in Wales says the same thing. And then Lindsay, yes, it's Lindsay Bertram Murray. He has the line, "O death, where is thy sting?" On his headstone, as well as here on his memorial in Australia. His memorial is an interesting one to point out. The kind of a sad fate of some of these personal memorials, of sometimes what happens to them. As you notice in the photo, the larger photo, he's part of a gate that used to entrance onto a church. That church is no longer there. It's now been demolished. This gate is literally sitting in a field, kind of just part of now a farmer's field. And so this is one of the unfortunate realities with some of these memorials, is that they unfortunately do get lost in time and place. And so it is unfortunately now in Australia sitting in a field rather than sitting in front of a church, allowing people to enter in. But it is still showing, right, his parents did attempt to recreate the two to be equal graves on both sides. All right, next one. As well, many of them found that it was important to link family members together. Family bonds oftentimes was an important tool to try and commemorate. So on your right-hand side there, you see there's two brothers, Edward Douglas and John Bond, who are commemorated in England. They both served and died in the war. As well, we have in Scotland two brothers who both served, one who died before the First World War and one who died in the war. That results in the two being connected together. They want to commemorate them in service together. And then this last one on the left-hand side here is probably one of the most interesting ones. It is to John Shenton and Austin Kirk Shenton, which is interesting because John Shenton died in the English Civil War, which is in the 1600s. Whereas Austin Kirk Shenton is his 11th generation descendant who fought and died in the First World War. But the family decided that these two soldiers who fought should be commemorated together. And so we see this interesting link of families wanting to connect their past with the present, trying to remember not only brothers who served together, but also distant relatives as well. Fathers, there are evidences of fathers and sometimes grandfathers serving. And it's interesting, particularly in this one, because John Shenton, who died in the Civil War, important to note, he was a royalist in the war. He was not part of the parliamentarians who overthrew the monarchy. He was a devoted loyalist and royalist in the war. And the memorial does speak to this kind of loyal duty to king and country, with the king being kind of that key figure in there. And we see this a lot kind of coming through in other memorials. They served their death, as for example, right? A glorious death is his who for his country falls. It's like this patriotic language as well as being brought in with these memorials. On to the next one. Now, men are not the only ones being commemorated, and it's important that we do need to talk about some women who did pass away in the war. Their numbers are, in the First World War, far fewer than in the Second World War. Particularly in British context, there was less civilian deaths in the First World War, but a number of nurses did fight and serve in the war, and some of them did pass away in the conflict. And it's interesting to note in that many of them there's little difference between memorials to women and memorials to men. Oftentimes they are using the same language, they're using the same designs, they're using the same, they're put in the same locations. So for example, this is a neat one. I tried to find a closer up of the actual plaque, but I could not, which is of Rena McLean, who is a nurse who served in the Canadian forces, and she was a nurse. She learned how to be a nurse at Mount Allison University in New Brunswick. And her plaque is amongst all the other plaques for the war. So that's all of the Mount Allison war dead from the First World War, the Second World War. They've had a couple peacekeepers as well. They also put up some other notable individuals who fought and was alumni of Mount Allison, and she was deemed worthy to be put up with them. So she was put up by nursing students in 1928 after the war as a way to commemorate her death. And so she's placed in the center of these with all of these memorials to serve as a reminder, not only to other students, but particularly to women attending the university, that this is an example of how to serve, an example to follow of loyalty and duty to your country, in the same way for the male students seeing the list of names of soldiers who fought. Others are kind of remembered together by their groups. So Ella Maud Bond and Margaret S. Dewar were two Scottish nurses. They both served overseas and were killed fighting in the war at two different times, but they both served in the same hospital unit. And so the Glasgow Western Infirmary, which is the hospital that provided the unit to serve overseas, were the ones who put this plaque up to these two nurses so that they could be remembered back home for their service. But also, as well as we see with Edith Catherine and Percy Walter, brother and sister who both enlisted and died in the war, they're commemorated together to remember their deaths. Edith Catherine, interestingly enough, is a sign, that the war was beyond the front lines. She was actually killed in a torpedo attack. She was on board, it was the SS Leinster, which was a Royal Mail ship traveling between Ireland and England, and so she was on the ship traveling back to England when it was torpedoed by a German U-boat, and she was one of the many civilians who died in it in October of 1918. So, civilians did pass away in this war as well, and in my research I have come across several civilians, and it's important to kind of look at how are they remembered as well. Is their service, their deaths, is it equal to the men's? And I would say it is, considering the way that she's remembered equally with her brother, who was a soldier in the First World War as well. You want to head to the next one? So we kind of talked a little, just about a lot of the religious language that they used, who is trying to remember, but it's kind of interesting to look at some of this national language that comes up. So each of the nations that I'm looking at, we do see a kind of unique group of people who try to remember in a distinctly nationalist way. And one of the most unique ones is the English, with using lines, as you can kind of see in these three, live thou for England, he for England died, with the fight well, we died and never knew, but well or ill, England, we died for you. And finally, on the bottom one here, England had need of them, which is an interesting kind of language that they're using. Why are they talking about England? Is this not the United Kingdom of Great Britain, or the British Empire? And it's interesting to note that we see groups of people already identifying with their own national identity rather than with this bigger imperial project and the British Empire. We see this in some other ones coming up, but in this England one, this largest group of people are more interested in serving England rather than they are serving this kind of idea of the empire. Which is, this one is perhaps the bottom one is most interesting because the two soldiers who are commemorated on it fought for the Australians, but their memorial says England had need of them, right? This idea that as colonial soldiers, we were to respond to the motherland, to England's call for help. If you want to head to the next one. But we do see some unique different groups coming in. So the Welsh perhaps were some of the most unique ones in that a large number of Welsh decided to commemorate their war dead, not in English, but in the Welsh language. I will not be reading these plaques because I don't want to be insult the Welsh language there. But so these are two kind of examples. This is a kind of a very standard plaque, which when translated actually doesn't say, is not exactly very, well, it doesn't say anything about how, Welsh nationalism. It actually uses the same language. It says, to the memory of Rhys Davies, he fought in the Great War in France, and then he died in September 23rd, 1918, the age of 20 years old. So there's not a lot kind of to the memorial, but what makes it so interesting is the fact that they decided that his family said, no, this needs to be in Welsh, right, to denote his unique Welshness, his unique Welsh identity. And finally, we have another statue here to an individual named Hedwyn. That was his poet name. He was a poet, he was a Welsh poet. He won a Welsh poetry contest, but won it, unfortunately, after he had died. So he had submitted his poems, he was killed, and then he was announced as the winner of this contest. So they put this statue up to him, and he wrote in Welsh, and so he was remembered as this Welsh figure. And so we do see these groups of people trying to remember, even within Britain, in a distinctly different manner, trying to assert their own unique national identity. Go ahead, the next one. Ireland perhaps is the most obvious one that would attempt to create its own identity. Ireland, after the First World War, would go through a series of wars for independence and then creating their own state, breaking away from Britain. And so it would be very obvious. And oftentimes the question is, why is there memorials even in Ireland? But there was an attempt to commemorate individuals in Ireland after the war. Ireland suffered more dead in the First World War than they did in their wars of independence or their civil war after. And so many of them try to create these distinct Irish groups and identities. And these are two individuals who are very famous. The first one is Thomas Kettle, who has this bust. It's located in a park in central Dublin, one of the main parks in Dublin. And his was an unbelievable fight to show how hard it was sometimes for people to try and commemorate. His friends and family wanted to put this up for him, but the government would not allow it to be put up. So the memorial actually makes no reference to the fact that he was a soldier. It makes no reference to the fact he died fighting in the First World War. It simply puts his year of birth, year of death, which is 1916. It states his occupation before the war and states he died in France. And that's it. It doesn't say he was a soldier. It doesn't say anything else. And this was their only way to get this memorial for him up. And so for anyone who doesn't know who he is, you see this memorial, you assume he's just this poet, educated individual who's an Irish nationalist, and you don't realize that he fought in the First World War. Others, for example, had to be hidden. So this is Major William Redmond. His brother was the leader of Ireland during the war and got Ireland to support the Britain in the war. And so he followed his brother's lead and enlisted and was killed in the war fighting. And so the only memorial to him for many years was this plaque, which was placed in the church that he has attended before the war. As you can see, it does bring very distinct Irish, kind of the Celtic motifs involved. And very interestingly, it is in a Catholic church, whereas most in Ireland, Catholics would not have commemorated the war because of very large hatred towards British for what they had done. But throughout Ireland, you can enter Catholic churches and do find war memorials are sitting there because families needed to find a way to commemorate and mourn their dead beyond just simple political hatreds. This bust of him, which is now in actually Redmond Memorial Park, was a more recent park dedicated in Ireland, and they were able to put this bust of him up, showing the shifts in way memory functions. So this is very much kind of post-1980 Ireland, where they are willing to acknowledge and look at their history and look at their involvement in the First World War. And so this has allowed William Redmond and Thomas Kettle to begin to receive proper kind of attention by historians and the public, looking at kind of what does it mean, what did the First World War mean for Ireland. But many of these were silenced for decades after the war, but they did manage to try and commemorate in some way. New Zealand, not New Zealand, sorry, this is Australia's. Australia was a very unique case. Australia and New Zealand, like us, saw the First World War as a moment of national birth. This was a moment that the country became mature. It's important to note for Australia, especially if Canada celebrated its 50th birthday in 1917, Australia didn't even celebrate its 20th birthday during the First World War. It turned 20 in 1921. Right, so Australia was a very young country at this point, and so the First World War really galvanized the country together and helped build an Australian identity. And some of these memorials do point out to this. So Frederick James Maslin, he had two memorials actually put up to him. So he had a stained glass window here and a plaque in which he is referred to as an Anzac, which is the Australian New Zealand Army Corps. And so to be an Anzac, this myth of who is an Anzac, it means who is a true Australian. This is a symbol of Australian identity. And his stained glass window is unique because it's meant to be of him as a soldier. Yet you'll notice he doesn't wear the standard kind of soup tin hat, doesn't look like the standard kind of Tommy that we see in stained glass windows here in Canada or in Britain, because he wears the floppy hat of the digger. So the digger was the name they gave Australian soldiers. And so they wore this kind of cowboy floppy hat during the war, and it became the symbol for Australians. This is how you identify who's Australian and who's not. And so his stained glass window clearly is an attempt to separate, he is a digger, he is an Australian, he's an Anzac. Eric Anderson Whiting, for example, as well, is very clearly stated to be an Anzac, true to his God and his country. So already we see here in this kind of very young country turning to try and build national symbols of unity. How do they understand who they are as a country? The Anzacs are what it is. And so the myth of the Anzac and Gallipoli is a huge in Australian memory and commemoration. They commemorate April 25th, far larger than they do November 11th, because for them, that is the moment their country really was born. And so to claim themselves to be an Anzac oftentimes is an attempt to put the soldier as part of this national myth that they have surrounding Gallipoli. Want to head to the next one? In Canada, it's actually fairly muted. I have found it was actually a lot more difficult for me to try and find very distinctly kind of Canadian symbols in Canada, which I thought was kind of interesting compared to some of the other countries. But one of the big ones is oftentimes, as we ask, is how does Quebec respond to the war? Quebec, of course, rejected conscription in 1917. There were riots because of this, over this. The threats of the country being, unity was being threatened because of this, particularly coming from Quebec. And so you do see very few memorials in Quebec, particularly to French Canadians about the First World War. And so one of the very few ones I have found, I put up here, which is to Jean Blument. He was a lieutenant and he won the Victoria Cross. And so this memorial was put up to him as a plaque in French. It's one of the only French memorials that I have been able to find. He does receive further commemoration going forward. So he now has a park in Montreal named after him, where he has this kind of a art piece to him. It's far more recent, but this plaque is a far older one with it as well. But in terms of how Canadians particularly tried and the government tried was Parliament Hill. So the Peace Tower, the House of Commons, was rebuilt after the war as a war memorial. So if you won't be able to get a chance, unfortunately, now with they're doing the renovations in the building, but I managed to get in before the renovations and did get to see some of the memorials and things that they have in there. And so this was the one that was very interesting to me, as it's the only memorial to an individual that's created by the Canadian government, which is to George Harold Baker. He was an MP and the only MP in Canada to die in combat. And so his fellow MPs decided he needed this memorial to be put up. And I think he's kind of an interesting figure to think about in terms of why he is put up here in our House of Commons. He's this individual who is meant to represent what it is to be Canadian, you know, trying to encourage other Canadians, particularly politicians, you know, this is the example to follow, the service and loyalty to your country, and to go forward, continually trying to make the place better. Baker's an interesting case because he gets this big statue right in the heart of House of Commons. You might have actually, if you ever watched old kind of interviews with the Prime Minister or the leader of the opposition, because in the hallway where the statue is located is where after the session they would come out and all the media cameras would film them. So sometimes he does kind of pop up in the background, depending on the angle of the camera is. But he's not the only Canadian MP who died in the war. There was another Canadian MP who died from Uxbridge. He, however, did not die in combat. He started suffering shell shock, and he was returned home to Canada, and unfortunately, he committed suicide. Most doctors believed at the time that it was due to the shell shock and the what we would now say is post-traumatic stress that he received in the war. But he was not deemed worthy to be remembered. So this is kind of an interesting case. His family commemorated him in Uxbridge, where he was from, and attempts have very recently to put a plaque up in the House of Commons has been made to try and ensure that he gets the same recognition. But for decades, we only remembered Baker as the MP who died in the war. And this is the true way forward. And so it's interesting, we have to think about when these memorials are put up, there are underlying messages that sometimes they are trying to push and trying to ignore some other things that are kind of sometimes a little dangerous to let happen. The next one. And I felt I had to, as soon as I knew I was coming to see London Middlesex, I felt I had to put up some that I had. And so these are two memorials in London. And they're actually fairly interesting stories about the afterlife of how, and particularly the stained glass window. But I'll start with this cross here, which is located in St. Paul's Cathedral in downtown London. You'll notice it's a wooden cross. What is interesting was, if you remember back to the very first photo of King George at Tynecott Cemetery, he was not standing in front of stone headstones. He was standing in front of little crosses. They were all wooden crosses. So when the commission first created the cemeteries, this is how they marked all of the graves, with these wooden crosses. And when they were then, the headstones were ready, they then took these wooden crosses out because they were meant to only be temporary, put the headstones in as permanent replacements. So then they had this issue of what do we do with all of these wooden crosses now? They had hundreds of thousands of these wooden crosses. Well, people in Britain started asking for them. They started writing to the commission, asking if they could have the crosses sent to them. And the commission at first said, okay, that's no problem if you pay for the shipping, and people were paying for it and away they went. And this started to snowball, and soon the governments were asking if they could do this for their citizens. And so it became policy from the commission that once the headstone was replaced, if the individual family wanted the wooden cross, they could have it. And so this is an example here in Canada where he was killed. He was killed at Vimy Ridge in April 9th, 1917. And so, this was at Vimy, and the Canadian, his family here in London wanted it, and it was shipped all the way across. And so now it sits in the church in St. Paul's. And so these are not as common in Canada or in Australia because of the distance the cross would have to travel and the heavy cost it would afford the family would have to pay. But they are all over Britain, and you can find them all over Britain in churches as well. So this is an interesting way of people trying to remember, here they have the original grave, bringing piece of the soldier back that was originally there. And then the stained glass window is an interesting one. If you've ever been to the Royal Canadian Regiment Museum, and you've gone into what they call it Chapel Wolseley, or the Quiet Room, and they have some stained glass windows in the back. And this is the one that's in the center. And this was originally located in Bethesda, in the Bethesda United Church. And unfortunately, Bethesda United Church closed in the 1970s. And so the question was, what do they do with these memorials and things that they had in it? And so the Royal Canadian Regiment volunteered and took this stained glass window for this soldier. So it has managed to survive. But this was not the case for many memorials. Many of them would have been lost as churches closed, which is one of the great fears, particularly for historians and things, who want to kind of look at this, particularly for myself. I've come across references to churches where these memorials exist, but unfortunately the churches are closed, so I don't have any proof that they actually do exist. I just have someone's word that they exist. So it's unfortunate some of them are being lost as, the dynamics of 100 years later. Churches change. Yeah, the world changes around us. So these are two, I felt, very interesting ones in London that they are around, so you can go in, and if you head into St. Paul's, you can go find, or even head into the RCR Museum, you can find that memorial and see in the person what I'm talking about. Next one. In terms of how other ways people try to remember, these are very wordy, so I'm going to talk to you about what they say on them. People attempted to not just try and remember nationally through unique national ways, but also through imperial activities. So Ernest Edward Brannigan and Charles Allen Learmonth both were veterans of the Boer War before they enlisted for a second time in the British Army to serve in this First World War, where they unfortunately passed away. As well, Duncan Campbell was a lifelong soldier. He served overseas in as far places. He served in West Africa. He served as well as in the Boer War. Others served in India, fighting in what is modern day Afghanistan. Others had fought all over Africa, in East and West and South Africa. Some had even served in Egypt in the 1880s. And so what we have is that a lot of memorials, people want to make connections to their imperial service in the past. And part of the reason they do this is same way that we still commemorate. How do we commemorate soldiers today? We still use, the poppy 2-minute silence, which came from the First World War, but we still do it, for example, our soldiers who died in Afghanistan. We use old remembrance in the modern day. And so here, they don't have this same legacy, so they're using their historic memory. They're using, how do you remember soldiers who fought in imperial wars? You do it by listing their medals, you list where they served, what glorious deeds they did in the battlefields in previous imperial wars. So they look to their imperial past to try and find a way to remember to go forward. And so this is just two examples here. If you want to go to the next one, this is one of the most unique ones in that this is an uncle, Frank Power, who had died in Khartoum with General Charles Gordon in the 1880s, and then his nephew, who very clearly is named after him, as his nephew's name is Frank Power O'Reilly. And Frank Power O'Reilly died in the Battle of Jutland in 1916. He was in the Royal Navy. And the two memorials, I couldn't get them together very nicely, but this memorial would be here, and then right underneath it is Frank Power O'Reilly's memorial. And this memorial even makes direct reference to his uncle up above. And the clear connection between the two is that they both served Imperial, the British Empire. So Frank Power is remembered as he was a journalist. He wasn't a soldier, but he's fought to try and bring the British Empire's rule throughout Africa. And O'Reilly is remembered for trying to defend the British Empire. So both of them, their services are equated as equals going forward. And so they're using their imperial pasts and even their legacy of their ancestors to try and understand and how to commemorate this war. As well, what we do see is that there are examples throughout in other, of using British symbols to try and remember. So in Australia, we see the use of the Union Jack being put up as part of their flags. Here we have a Canadian who's remembered in Wales. He is probably very distinctly Canadian. They put the Canadian badge on his memorial to remember him in Wales. But he is denoted as having served in British Imperial forces. He serves in the 1st Canadian contingent, but that's actually part of the British Imperial forces, not its own unique Canadian entity. And then finally, down in New Zealand, the stained glass window. We see particularly this knighted figure here of St. George. St. George is, in terms of the use of stained glass windows, it's a contest between whether it's a Jesus at some point in his life or it's St. George. Those are oftentimes the two figures used most on stained glasses for soldiers. So St. George again and again shows up over and over. And why does he show up? He's England's patron saint. England's the motherland. We have to remember our connections back to the motherland. And so we do see this continued use both of the Union Jack, St. George, and in other times connections that colonial troops are in fact serving in imperial forces. And this is kind of an interesting dynamic that we see going on, that some think nationally, but some think imperially. And there's a contest between them over how to remember the war. To the next one. And so others, though, did try to use what was available to them. Many of these memorials are very expensive. I kind of want to point this out. Stained glass windows are not cheap. Putting up those extremely elaborate marble and bronze plaques would not be available to the everyday person. And so for many of these individuals, if you had kind of seen, a lot of officers were being remembered, which was just simply oftentimes a case of class, who has the money to afford. And so I wanted to point here 3 examples of ways that other working class and others in society could try to remember. So one is again, the wooden crosses. Oftentimes these crosses you could afford to buy and pay for the transportation. As I said, much more common in the UK than in Canada, simply because it was cheaper to ship across from France to Scotland than from France to Canada. However, in Canada, every soldier received 2 items from the imperial government for soldiers who died. They received this scroll, which was a printed text that had been approved by King George V, stating his thanks for their service in the war and him wishing condolences for the family for the loss of their loved one. And so this was printed out and sent to every family next of kin for soldiers. Accompanying this scroll was this penny. It was nicknamed the dead man's penny because you only got it if someone had died in the war. But it was a commemorative little coin. It wasn't, the picture's kind of blown up a little bit. So it's kind of, I would say it's probably around like yay big, give or take. Mass printed, and they would have the name of the soldier would be printed on it. And so this was meant to be a commemorative plaque or penny that they would give out to people, and it would come with this scroll. And so these two examples here are ways that people have tried to commemorate going forward using some of the cheaper options for them. So one, putting this penny inside a larger memorial, or sometimes people would just simply keep the penny and just have it mounted in a plaque of some kind or in a frame, as well framing right the scroll. And this one as well is very good because one of the other ways people often remembered was photographs. They kept photographs that they had sent back. So this one, for example, is of James Elliott, who was from Saskatchewan. So this is a photograph of his unit taken before they departed for the war. And then this is the scroll that was sent to his sister after he died. This is also kind of a unique story of the difficulty of trying to see how much of these survive, because this was kept by his sister in her private home for decades. And when she eventually passed away, his family decided to donate it to, as you can see, the Royal Canadian Legion that's located in Cardiff, Saskatchewan, which is a very tiny little town. I had to look it up on Google. It was unbelievably small. And they fortunately kept it. They decided not to get rid of it. And so this has now survived. But many of these have ended up in museums all over the country. So local museums have often sometimes taken them, or bigger museums. So the Canadian War Museum has a fair number, particularly of the pennies in their collection. You can search up and they have photographs of them.
Sure.
That's okay. We'll just start with this one. But to kind of end off, this kind of the final thing I wanted to talk about is some people who we may have missed in societies. So a lot of these people are very much white, Anglo-Saxon, or Anglo-Celtic. And oftentimes what's often forgotten is Indigenous troops that served. Unfortunately, in Canada and Australia, after the war, the Indigenous troops were forgotten. They were ignored. They were denied access to rights and kind of the rewards for being soldiers. So one of the most unique cases was in New Zealand, where this did not happen. In New Zealand, the local Maori, their indigenous population there, were able to actually commemorate the wars and their participation in the war on an equal level to the settlers who also fought. Now, during the war, the Maori had not been allowed to serve in combat units in the same way, but a number of Maori had died in the war as they sometimes just decided to ignore orders and move into the front lines when they should have been staying in the back. And so we see that a number of Maori did die in the First World War, and they did create very unique memorials to their war dead. This is a stained glass window here, which is in a church that is located entirely, it's a Maori church. All the attendants are Maori, so the entire church is decorated in Maori art. And so the stained glass window, as you can see, it has the two soldiers that it's commemorated. They're two Maori officers who had died in the war, and so they put them here in the stained glass window. And so we see this interesting mix of both Maori but also British commemoration with Christian symbolism going in, but also the art design, right? All the patterns on the outside are Maori, distinctly Maori designs. As well, we have the statue. He was a reverend. He was the chaplain for the Maori Pioneer Battalion during the First World War. He survived the war, but unfortunately died shortly after in 1920. And so they put this memorial up to him, not as a Maori soldier to try and commemorate not only his actions in the war, as he was one of the many Maori soldiers looked up to him as their representative and helper, but also to try and commemorate all other Maori who had died in the war. And so they built this statue to him here. What's interesting is, if you want to hit to the next slide as well, that these memorials are written, the language on them, on all the memorials, are actually written in English and in Maori. So it's a mix of both, which is why I'm not going to be reading any of it off, because again, like the Welsh, I will butcher the language. But we do see the Maori here trying to put themselves as equals in the empire. And so these are the last two memorials I have to look at today, which are kind of an interesting ones. This one is to a young Maori girl. Her name was Hera Takura, and she never served overseas. She never left New Zealand during the war. She died when the Spanish influenza came to New Zealand in 1918. However, they built this memorial to her, and on it, they emphasize her service to the empire and to trying to help the First World War. She was an active participant in raising money for the Red Cross. So she participated in this local fair where she was named Queen of the fair, and as named Queen of the fair, she actually went out and fundraised the most money to donate to the Red Cross during the war. So she was very active there, and when she died, they built this memorial to her, and on it they very clearly say she died, but she was a loyal servant of the empire. And finally, the last one we have is this Alexander Ormond Memorial, which is actually part of a larger memorial, which unfortunately speaks to the Maori's continuing difficulties, as the Maori were allowed to be able to commemorate in ways that Canadian Indigenous troops were unable to. The Maori were still viewed, though, however, as being lesser in some of the eyes of New Zealand society. And this example here is, this statue is of Alexander Ormond, whose family lived in New Zealand, in this Hawke's Bay, in the town there. And they built this memorial to their son, and they decided to, however, let the community list the number of dead as well on the memorial. So the statue's of Alexander, and it's to him, but they allowed it to be a community memorial as well. When you look at the names of the people who died, they're all Maori. So the entire community who fought, the soldiers who fought from this community were all Maori soldiers. However, the kind of settler gets to get pride of place over the Maori soldiers, even though they are the local community who are named on it. So this is still kind of this not an equal stance in New Zealand with these Indigenous troops. But hopefully what I've done today is, I'm still putting together ideas on this project, so if this seemed a little disjointed, I apologize for that. But I wanted to get you a sense of kind of the huge variety of memorialization that was out there, that people across Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand all attempted to remember in different ways. Many of these memorials, as I said, some of them have been lost, some of them are kind of now hidden, or kind of forgotten to some degree. But it's interesting to look at the ways in which these individuals tried to be remembered and tried to distinctly bring the actual face of war to the surface, rather than allowing them to be absorbed into the larger mass of people. They tried to bring them to the forefront, try to ensure that their memory is preserved in a unique and distinct way, and that they are more than just soldiers. They are individuals in society who are remembered, and they did serve as well. So thank you for allowing me to talk. I think I just hit the hour mark, so it might be a little long. I apologize for that.
Do we have any Any questions at all? Feel free to ask. Yeah, go ahead.
In London, Ontario, after the First War, there used to be a commemoration of each day, each day. I know I've got a picture at home of it in 1923, and I've also got a picture of a group of English or former English or Canadians who joined the Canadian Army who were English immigrants.
Yeah.
And they're marching with the English flag, and they're called the Sparrows. Can you help me on that?
I have no idea why they're called the Sparrows.
I've got pictures of both of them, and I can't find out the answers.
About why they're called the Sparrows. I have no idea why they would be called the Sparrows. That would require some more.
Pardon?
That would require some more digging, I think, to figure that one out. But I'm not that surprised when you say that they're the English soldiers.
Well, they're marching with the Cross of St. George.
Yeah, I'm not that surprised. If anyone knows this, if you've seen the cenotaph in Victoria Park,
Yeah.
it's a carbon copy of the cenotaph in London, England.
Yeah.
So it's kind of not only did we use London, we use the way they commemorate and things like that. So it's kind of I'm not that surprised that they would be marching with the Cross of St. George. We know, like, the majority of the soldiers who fought in the Canadian Armed Forces in the First World War were British born. So I'm not, the Sparrows part, I don't know that one. I can't help you. They call themselves, I know there are old contemptible societies throughout Canada from the survivors who had immigrated to Canada after the war, but I've never heard of the Sparrows before. I'm going to have to look that one.
How about Eep's Day?
Yeah, I'm not.
That was April 4th, I think it was, in 1922.
Yeah.
And it was, if you're looking down Queens Ave, the Anglican Church is here, and there's hundreds and hundreds of people on the street and on the lawns of the church.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not that, I know so Yeep Day would be, was commemorated in other places in Canada. The Psalm would be commemorated in places. So Northern Ireland, for example, they still have marches on July 1st for the Battle of the Somme. In Britain, they have other ones. So they do the Somme remembrance as well. And then, Yeep Day and Gallipoli is, they're two, almost the exact same kind of idea when you think about, for Canadians, it's our first test in battle. For the Australians, Gallipoli is their first test in battle. It's just kind of interesting that we dropped Yeep Day, right? It kind of fell off as a commemorative moment of commemoration, and now we kind of focus all of our energy on Remembrance Day, whereas the Australians have kept Gallipoli and Anzac Day going, which is kind of an interesting dynamic between our two countries. So, we did celebrate Yeep Day. I think it started to fall off. I think it started to fall off after the Second World War, where once we had started having to commemorate the Second World War, they had started to focus more of the attention on Remembrance Day, because it allowed for a greater group to participate. The new veterans could join the old veterans on a single day, instead of placing priority over one or the other, as Yeep Day kind of would, with the kind of, this is the First World War, and then now we wanted the Second World War veterans to be able to participate as well.
I can speak to the Sparrows. I just looked it up really quickly. Wikipedia. So it says the 79th Light Anti-Aircraft Battery, also known as the Sparrows, was a Royal Artillery unit of the British Army that fought in the Battle of Britain, the Battle of Java, and the Battle of Timor. So that's the Second World War, but perhaps the name then carried on from previous, whether the same group or the same type of fighting anti-aircraft. I don't know.
Yeah.
But that's sort of just the first real quick look up.
Yeah.
perhaps
They might have,
participated
yeah,
in.
because Britain did develop anti-aircraft batteries during the First World War, because London was bombed by German planes in the First World War and by Zeppelins, so that might have been
Yeah.
a continuation maybe of that. We'd have to
Yeah.
look into that. No, thanks for that. That's...
This might be an unfair question, but do you have any idea of the German individual memorials in Germany, the other side of the war?
Yeah, so I have a little bit. Unfortunately, Germany did not get this. There was some commemoration in Germany of the same way. One of the most famous ones that is discussed is Kathy Koltz. I believe I'm saying her name right. She was a very famous German artist, and her son died in the First World War, and she designed a mourning mother and father statues, and they got them placed in the cemetery where her son was buried in Belgium, and they're still there today that you can go visit them. So that is perhaps one of the most famous instances of a private kind of commemoration on the German side, and many people kind of refer to it, but I know nationally in Germany there was the problem of how do we commemorate the war afterwards, and then kind of it was hijacked. A lot of the commemoration was hijacked by the Nazi Party when they came to power, which then made today, kind of after the Second World War, any kind of commemoration of the First World War got tied in. If it was tied in with the Nazi Party, it was, put underground or destroyed or kind of hidden. And so part of the reason why Kathy Koltz's work is so remembered is because she was anti-Nazi, and her statues were outside of Germany, so they managed to survive kind of damage or anything done to them. But I think from what I've read about some German historians who have talked about it, there was a similar kind of commemoration was also going on, but I haven't not actually looked into how much of that has survived. As a lot of the problem is that a lot of stuff got wrapped in with the Nazi Party and then got, of course, it was then destroyed or hidden, or no one wanted to deal with it after the Second World War because it was at that point tainted in their eyes. But they did have a fair number of kind of that, they would keep in Germany during the war, they would create what they called iron soldiers or iron crosses using nails, and they would take kind of these little pieces of nails and hammer them in to create this artwork. And some of it was a community effort, but there was a lot of individual families would do that themselves as a commemorative way, and a lot of that has survived in German museums and things like that. But I have not actually looked into detail on it, so I don't know how widespread it is, as say it is for Britain and the British Empire.
Two things. First of all, dealing with Lori's question and this lady's reply. During the Second World War in Malta, there was a straight street, which was like Jarvis Street in Toronto. It's a red light district. And these British sailors, of course, frequented, presumably the soldiers in regard to what you said, because there was a gal there. I don't know if she owned the tavern or not. She certainly was a barkeeper and singer, but she was really beloved by all the British sailors and so on and so forth. And her nickname was Sparrow. So I made it that. So it might be no much connection with, now, going to you, I am just in awe on what you have done and what you are doing, because it's like genealogy. There's no end to it. And so I'm concerned about you.
Oh, don't worry.
I was many years ago in the same position you are in now, is to, at what point do you sort of withdraw and start to put this together, and what do you envision your doctoral thesis as sort of being and doing. If this can be done in 2 or 3 sentences.
Yeah, 2-minute thesis, go. No, actually, you're not the only one who's concerned.
Dr. General says too.
This is Professor Vance's, one of his big things on me is kind of, we got to stop at some point. And so, but you're right. No, it is, my idea kind of to put it together is to be part of this kind of, when we read histories of memory and memorials, I want to get away from talking about communities and talk about individuals, which is kind of what I wanted to do, kind of put this idea that there is, as individuals, we have the ability to change how we remember things or how we commemorate things, and that's kind of what my project wants to do, is to kind of bring the individual back into this discussion that historians have. Because I find that it's too much talking about how does a community or how does a nation, and I was like, well, individuals are actually the ones making the decisions, and sometimes even small plaques that people decide to put up, even if it's very simple, it does have a powerful message, and it can influence the way that we go forward. So it's kind of that idea of like, the individual does have an important place in how we remember and in the commemoration process. But you're right, I'm at the point now where my supervisor and everyone else is saying, you gotta stop. And it is almost like, I think I was like kind of lucky I got to talk, because all of my research for some of these individuals is using genealogical research and websites. Using Ancestry is one of the biggest tools I use to do a lot of this stuff, to find out who some of these people are. And I'm pretty sure the tools that I use are probably the same ones you guys are using to do your own family research. I'm just don't have family story background, so I'm kind of flying in blind with some of these people, hoping I find something. But it's kind of, sometimes I'm just shooting in the dark and hope I find something good there. But it is using the same tools to do all of this stuff, which means I do need to stop at some point. Ancestry can only keep going so far.
Bryan, I'm curious about, did your research include, I'm sure the discussions or debates that countries had after the First World War about whether they should commemorate them or not, because are you glorifying war versus remembering the individual or service? Did your thesis touch on that at all in terms of why we would remember it, like have a memorial?
Yeah.
A national memorial.
Yeah, so there is discussion about that, and there's no question that they say, no, we have to remember. Every nation is doing it, and it even starts, from the very beginning for Britain in 1914, it starts when their first soldiers are dying, and then for Canadians, it starts in when our first soldiers start dying in 1915, and that's like, it's almost from the very get-go. There's never any doubt that that the governments and the general community consensus is that this needs to be done, that we need to remember this. And then it does turn into, after the war, a bit of that, it does turn into that debate, and how do we do this in a way that, doesn't glorify war, but it does do justice to the soldiers. And so that actually, it's the commission, the War Graves Commission, they struggle, in the early days when they first formed, they struggle with this message, and they think about, how do we do this? How do we go forward in this way? And they reach out to fairly artistic individuals. So Rudyard Kipling, for example, serves on the commission's board as one of their chief literary and artistic advisors. And in many of the phrases like, their name shall live on forevermore, a soldier known unto God, kind of those phrases actually were, Kipling was the one who came up with those and said, no, we should use this phrase. So a lot of those phrases, when you see them, that's Rudyard Kipling's influence into it. And he was very conscious of that fact of how to go forward with this, and the head of the commission was as well. And after the war, he very much wanted to strive to create, the commission purpose was to not just remember, but to show pride in the great sacrifice and the actual success of the British Army and and particularly he thought he was an imperialist, so he thought as the empire as a whole. So he wanted to show the glory for everyone in the empire. And then, but he also was very concerned with making sure that it was respectful, and very much he was concerned with making sure that this doesn't happen again. Did not want to see such large-scale devastation again, because he got into doing war graves because he was actually originally an ambulance driver, and he kept coming across bodies that were left unattended, and so he'd start burying them, and then he'd find, little makeshift cemeteries or makeshift graves, and he was like, no, they need to be remembered, they need to be done in a respectful manner. And so he was the one from 1914 was like, this needs to be done this way. And so he was very much concerned with creating this respectful image of the war dead. And so that's kind of when the cemeteries are designed. They are meant to inspire awe, but also sorrow at the same time. He created a blend of pride and sorrow together, so that people, feel very proud of what they see, about what they've done, but they realize, the thousands, all those headstones, all the names on the memorials. He wanted to make sure that people didn't walk away feeling, nothing. He wanted them to feel sad. He wanted them to feel some sorrow when they saw this stuff. So this was a debate going on, and the commission was very much dedicated. No, we're going to create a mix of pride and sorrow in what we do. And then I think some of these private memorials actually do it a little bit better when you look at them, because you realize this isn't, the commission, when they make the headstones, they don't know who these people are. They just got the names and information, and they record it, put it into the headstone, in it goes, and they move on. But when you see the private memorials, right, you know that this was designed by a family that, they may experience some pride in the fact that, what their sons or their daughters have done, but there's sorrow, there's unbelievable sorrow in some of the language that they use. And it's very obvious that this is, none of these memorials are essentially trying to glorify war. They are all very much all about, particularly when they talk about the redemption, using the language that they use, particularly when they're using biblical verses, it is very much in a sorrowful kind of manner that they experience pride, but also, that you have gone to a better place, and that this is not something to be glorified in any means. Their pride, pride and sorrow, as I seem to be repeating over and over again. That's what they tried to mix to try and avoid those issues.
Go ahead.
I wanted to mention, you said that the indigenous people in Canada were not allowed to have a separate memorial.
So they were essentially kind of unable to commemorate kind of in the same way after the war. So remembrance of indigenous soldiers is far more of a recent kind of activity.
You're on Manitoulin.
Yes, I was thinking of the Manitoulin. They built a beautiful memorial, about 20 years ago. They included all the soldiers, the ones that were alive and the ones that, and there was quite a large number of indigenous soldiers that were lost from the Manitoulin.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that there's some improvement anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's there's definitely been far bigger improvements in recent years with research going into it to try and include them into it. And I just part of what I wanted to do is the fact that this has been a lot of work recently has been done on this, and I'm just kind of pointing out that this is not the norm in our society, that it hasn't been regular for us to commemorate them.
Yeah.
And it's been kind of and for various reasons, they weren't able to be remembered or allowed to commemorate in a similar, on an equal
Yeah.
standing as they are now, which is, as you pointed, right, this is much more 20 years ago. It's starting to pick up even more, so kind
Oh,
of
that's
including
good.
it.
I just want to point out that it's not during the First World War that we start with this memorialization, because we take an example of London.
Mhm.
We have the Boer War Monument, and then if you go across over to St. Peter's Basilica, they have a memorial window to two of the parishioners that were killed in the Boer War. So
Yeah.
it had already started before this, and probably goes back earlier than that, this memorialization in this respect.
Yeah. So it's the First World War is the most interesting because it's in terms of scale is where it takes off, and as the Boer War, as there are Boer War examples, and in Britain even more of imperial examples when they're fighting in Egypt or in places in Africa or in India. They're there, but the scale is unbelievably large, so it kind of swallows everything up. It's kind of an example like the Boer War Memorial in Victoria Park. It kind of it's this very dynamic and very interesting looking memorial, like artistically in the way it's designed, but it's kind of always shunted a little bit off. It's not used in the same way that the First World War Memorial is. So it's kind of an interesting that these previous conflicts, that they do set the standard, and then the First World War kind of takes all of that and changes how we go forward. So I think First World War is a pivotal moment for changing how we remember war and how we commemorate war. But it is, as you said, it is building off of past experiences, but taking it in a kind of different and new direction.
May I ask a second question?
Oh, yeah.
I got a million, but would you say that 20 to 30% of all the casualties who were killed in the First War, British Empire, Canadian, Australian, etc., have never been found? Is that an exaggeration?
Trying to remember what the numbers are. I think it's about that. It's not a majority. It's most of the soldiers who died, their bodies have been found. I think I think now it's around somewhere between around 20% or so, but I don't know the exact number off the top of my head.
Well, they're still being found.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, they're still finding more soldiers. But they're having still, it's interesting now that there's, I was at a talk a couple of years ago from a Canadian, she was a forensic.
Meg Goldman?
No, it was Sarah Lockyer. She works for the commission, for the Canadian branch of the commission, to help them identify, if they have come across a soldier who they think is Canadian, they contact her, and she kind of does like forensic anthropology, archaeology. I forget what it is, but she's like an archaeologist and an anthropologist, and she does all the DNA tests on the bones and things like that. So they're still working these branches, the commission branches that started in 1917 and 1918 to identify bodies, have been running for 100 years because they're still identifying bodies, and if they can't identify them, they just rebury them with a headstone that says unknown soldiers. So and when they do identify, they do actually remove the name from the memorial to the missing. So Meningate has actually reduced the number of names on it now is less than when they first built it. So they are reducing the number when they find the bodies. They are, and identifying them. They are taking them off those memorials to the missing because they said they are not missing anymore. So they have a different status in terms of remembrance.
Sheila, you got something on that?
Well, I was just, so my grandfather was in the Boer War with the Imperial forces, and then came to Canada just before the First World War, and then well received again with the Canadian Expeditionary Forces. But when I was researching his South African, I have all his medals and his papers from that conflict. So I was curious about some people that were killed in those conflicts and how they were, where they were buried. I couldn't find very much information.
Yeah.
And I learned, and I may be wrong about this, but the Commonwealth War Graves Commission does not include that previous conflict.
No.
And is that a political reason or just a financial reason that it's, they're concentrating more on First World War going forward?
Yes, so when they were created specifically for the First World War. And then when the commission was established, people were like, oh, maybe they should take over the Boer War graves because they were being very poorly maintained. And it was a purely volunteer groups in South Africa were the only people maintaining them. But the commission didn't want to take over because they felt that it wasn't appropriate for them to do so. They would have had to change the constitution of their commission, and the cost value as well was an issue. They didn't realize how much money it was actually going to cost them to maintain all of the First World War graves. And so in the 1920s and 30s, they were having financial fights with the governments over how much they're actually going to be paying just for the First World War graves, which resulted in them kind of having to cut their budgets a little bit more than they would have wanted to. But I know they did end up taking over some older graves, in particularly some places in Africa and in the Caribbean, where the commission stated that they told all governments that if they wanted the commission to take over maintenance of the cemeteries, they would do so, but the government would have to give them extra money. And so in some places they do maintain more than just First and Second World War graves, but they do so not to the same, they don't use the same headstones. So they very much distinctly make sure that they are separate from the First and Second World War remembrance. And so I think in the case of South Africa with the Boer War, the South African government did not allow them to take over. So it became that kind of issues, some political and financial issues, and why they didn't take over. But part of the reason where the commission, the head of the commission, he wanted to create it because he saw the poor condition of the Boer War graves, and also the Crimean War from the 1850s. He was kind of not really happy with the way the graves were maintained, because they were supposed to be maintained by the British War Office, but they didn't want to spend the money to do so, so they were allowed to deteriorate, and he felt there needed to be something put in place, particularly with this, as the scale of the war changed, and the public interest in the war was very much different in the First World War than from the previous conflicts. So that kind of is one of the motivators for him to do so, to get involved, in the commission to get involved.
At the beginning, you said these were predominantly, the personalized memorials were predominantly Christian. Is there no evidence of other faiths or religion doing it, or it's just such a small scale?
So I have come across some Jewish memorials in England. They're a very small amount. I haven't really come across others outside of, I haven't come across any Hindu or Muslim. And I think part of the reason why was just who they allowed. Part of the reason is just who fought. So a lot of the soldiers who were fighting in the wars were Christian soldiers, were Christians, and they were the ones being recruited to fight. And it wasn't part of also the countries that I'm looking at, the soldiers that predominantly the forces they sent overseas to fight were predominantly kind of the white Anglo-Saxon male Christians, resulting in this is the memorials that are kind of being built. I had originally thought India would be an interesting country to look at as well, and then I realized that to look at India would be a task by itself. That would be a project by itself. So in terms of the question of am I going too far, I have managed to reel myself. But it was there, but the commission, it was interesting is reading the commission, they were very much concerned particularly with the headstone. Part of the reason they chose to do a headstone and not just a simple cross was the fear that it would alienate imperial troops from India. And they did not, because the commission, the founders were very much thinking about the empire as a whole, and they wanted to include everyone in the empire. They felt that it would be inappropriate to make the standard cross as the headstones, which resulted in a fight with some British politicians who wanted a cross. And in the 1920s, Winston Churchill had to stand up in the House of Commons in London and defend the commission's choice of using a headstone. So their concession was, we'll put the religious symbol in the middle to allow you to easily denominate, right, who's who, so everyone got their own. But there is, but unfortunately with the Indian soldiers, there was very few kind of participation in the commemorative, like the personalized commemoration. So a lot of the Indian troops don't have a personalized epitaph. The pennies that they created, the British War Office still has warehouses full of them that are for Indian troops who died in the First World War. Because the problem is that they don't, because they were recruited and they weren't properly kind of put through the same attestation papers, who's your next of kin, who do you contact, none of that, they didn't get a lot of that for them. So the problem is they don't know who to give these commemorative coins to. So they are still holding on to thousands of them because they just don't know they don't have anyone to give them to. And they've been sitting there since the First World War. But they were thinking, and so a lot of, because for Hindu troops, when they passed away, they would want to be cremated. So the British Army did cremate a lot of the Hindu troops as for their religious practices, and then a lot of them then are placed on memorial walls instead of having headstones, because they're like, no, this is the way that they do it, so we're going to do it this way. So the Indian memorial that's in France it is both a memorial to the missing, but also the kind of graves for Indian troops who were cremated, because this is the way. This is the way the Hindu troops want to be buried and dealt with after the war. So no, we're going to do it the way that they want, to make sure that they're happy and everyone feels respected and remembered. So you go to the Indian War Memorial and there's large lists of names, but part of it is for missing and part of it is for those who were actually cremated. So they were very conscious to try and make sure that everyone was included in any way they could. But it is almost predominantly Christian soldiers. So
I was going to give an example of a private memorialization. I belong to the Ashlar 610 Masonic Lodge in Bryan,
yeah.
And they have a section of the wall in the lodge that's dedicated in memory of past lodge members and whatnot, just a plaque and whatnot. And interestingly enough, you mentioned Rudyard Kipling. He was an active Freemason at the time too. So
yeah, I thought about putting a stained glass window up from a Masonic lodge in Dublin, and the memorial, it was one of the more unique stained glass windows because it was William Shakespeare, but it was to 3 members of the lodge who had died in the First World War, but they decided to commemorate them through Shakespeare. So I was like, that's one of the most unique ones I've come across.
Yeah. Well, we just wanted to thank Bryan for doing this presentation. I think it was fantastic. I think there were a lot of good questions as well. You've done a lot of work, obviously. And we wish you luck on your future endeavors with this.
Thank you.